So one of the most powerful tools that you can implement that will minimise the potential of micromanagement is how you structure your board agenda. If your board agenda is structured around operational reports, then by very definition that board meeting is much more likely to be micromanaging, because that's how we've set up the agenda, that's how we've set up the information, that's how we've set up the tone of that meeting, because it is focused on the operational issues, and therefore it gives credence and the ability for directors to actually get into the micromanagement, because that's how we've set the meeting up. What if we started to look at our agendas from slightly different points of view? Now, you will be doing some of these things already, but I want to give you some really practical, good examples of what you can do to start to change your agenda management to get people to focus on the stuff they should be focusing on. So, the first thing is the whole notion of a consent agenda. Now, if you're not using a consent agenda, it's sometimes called a block agenda. If you're not using this, I guarantee it's going to knock between 25 and 30% off the time of your board spent on useless items. Now, what it is that in any meeting, there are always three types of papers that come up to that meeting, three types of items that the meeting looks at. The first type is what is called a paper for noting, or a paper for information. We don't need to talk about it, it's just a heads up, here's how we're doing. Don't need any decision, don't really need to talk about it, just for information. It's just for noting, okay? So there's that first type. Second type of paper is one where we need some discussion, but we don't need to decide anything, we just need to give a bit of a heads up and where are these directions we might want to head into, but we don't need any formal recommendation, we just need to thrash out some of the ideas. So it's typically called a paper for discussion. And then the third type is a paper that has a recommendation attached to it, a paper where we've got to actually crunch it. We've got to make a decision of some sort. We've got to choose amongst these options. We've got to choose one, because then that means a whole range of other things are going to then flow on from that decision. So the three types of papers always are a paper for noting, a paper for discussion, and a paper for decision. Now, typically what happens is that the CEO or the company secretary, usually, not always, will have the first draft of the agenda, and they will allocate the various items on the agenda to one of those, a paper for noting or paper for information, paper for discussion, or a paper that has a decision or a recommendation attached to it. Then that goes to the chair, and the chair approves it and makes any changes as they see fit, because in the end, at law, the chair actually owns the agenda, but someone's got to write it. Usually it's one of the staff that write it. And then all those papers that are for noting are put in a block, which is why sometimes it's called a block agenda. And usually that block is at the end of the agenda. So all those items on the agenda that are for information only or for noting only are put in a block at the end of the agenda. Or sometimes they're sequentially put throughout the agenda, but they're called consent agenda because we consent not to talk about them, because after all they're for information only. And then when you have a look at your agenda, you have present, apologies, declaration of interest, noting and approval of consent agenda items, or noting and approval of block agenda items. And that's where the chair simply says, okay, so all those items for noting we'll take as read. Can we have a vote to approve that they have been accepted as read? Easy. The trick behind that, though, is you will always get a director who says, no, hang on a second, I want to talk about one of those. The great trick behind this is to say to that director, well, number one, if you wanted to talk about it, you should have asked me prior to this board meeting so that we could take it off. Number two, for me to take it off the consent agenda, you, director, have to convince me, chair or lead director, that it is of strategic note, that there is a strategic issue that we need to talk about, but you've got to convince me before I'll put it back on the agenda for discussion. And if you weren't able to get to me prior to the board meeting, then what I want you to do now is convince me there's a really strategic issue behind it that is worthy of our time as a board. Now, many directors say, I've got the right to talk about anything I like as a director. Well, the answer to that is, no, you don't. I, as the chair, manage this board meeting in the way that I see fit, and we're going to focus on strategic issues. So, what's the strategic issue behind you wanting to talk about this? Now, again, you don't let this drag on for a long time, but I've seen too many boards where the directors will take things off the consent agenda or the block agenda, and they'll take half a dozen items off because they want to know a little bit more detail about something, all right? Please don't allow that to happen. If one of your directors has an issue that they need some clarification on, set up the mechanism where they know they have to ask for that clarification prior to the board meeting. And you will then let all of the other directors know what the clarification that was asked for and what the response to that was. Make sure you send it out to all the other directors as well. You never want to hear at a board meeting from a director, "Oh, Chair, what does this mean?" All right, you want to know that before the board meeting. So this is how you can set up a consent agenda or a block agenda item. Usually a third to a half of the items on any board meeting are usually consent or for information only. You need to manage that, and the idea of a consent agenda or block agenda is one of the most powerful techniques that you can use to make sure that we do not get into micromanagement, because we're talking about items that will lead to micromanagement.